So the focus of this conversation I've had, I actually reached out to you to kind of share some of your ideas and points that certainly you'd like to share today, but overall you all understand that what we're really going to sort of, our aim today is to talk about and reflect on new approaches for narratives from the decolonized perspective. But before we start, and I talked about memory work, if you could each take 45 seconds and describe, and I'll start with Lars, describe what you do as a memory worker. What would your legacy be?
Well, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm a feature film director. I'm a writer, screenwriter, and director, and I did a lot of films about German history because our history is so violent. Now with my last film, I try to create a story that to bring to the big screen that tells us about German colonialism in Namibia in the years 1904 to 1908. Telling us about the genocide from the perspective of the perpetrators. That's what I did.
Thank you. Emma.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So I am a young MP and Deputy Minister of Information, Communication Technology in Namibia. And my ministry is tasked particularly with the film industry to preserve our history. So we try to get as much funding as possible for the film industry, but also to collaborate with private sector to try to boost up expertise and skills for young filmmakers in the country, and hopefully use new and emerging technologies to preserve our history.
Thank you. Nina.
Good morning, everyone. Wow, my work as a memory worker has been a long journey of approximately 10 years, if I have to put time to it. Starting off as an environmental manager on an airport construction site and having to deal with archaeology, which unfortunately in this circumstance was a burial ground, and having to deal with human remains directly. So that's one aspect of memory working. But more recently, it has been leading a community into engaging with their resources, their cultural heritage resources, and reconnecting to a history rooted in trauma. Which is very difficult to do, especially if the resources are not made available for communities to do so. So that's the harder part of the work that I've been doing for the past 10 years, but it's also the most rewarding part.
Thank you. Thank you for that. All right, so we'll dive in with our first sort of question regarding the future and what you each, I'd like to hear from all of you individually, what you each think about or envision, or how would you describe the future of storytelling, decolonized storytelling? Who would like to start? Okay.
Archaeology has always been very interesting to me because of that strong essence of storytelling that it's rooted to. With the field of archaeology, you have this immediate contact with history that's so hard to connect with. I mean, history in school for me was boring, extremely boring. It was dates, names you had to remember. There was no emotional or spiritual connection to what you were learning. And that's not who I am. I'm a very emotionally and spiritually rooted individual. Archaeology, first-hand contact, has this access to jewelry and beads that were laid to rest with burial grounds, which is a highly emotional and spiritual concept. So I envision a future where these cultural heritage resources belong first and foremost to the descendant community. At the moment, it belongs to everyone else: scientists, historians, archaeologists, developers, governments, everyone but the rightful authorities, which are descendant communities. And my fight has been made so much harder in fighting for the preservation of such sacred spaces because I'm not deemed to be the rightful authority of that site. I have to fight and climb over many hurdles in order to prove that my relationship with that heritage and that resource is first and foremost legitimate. And that is the continuation of the struggle, and that is the continuation of colonialism and slavery.
If I could go next, I think from my perspective, being a young Namibian, I've seen in the society I grew up that one, through colonialism and apartheid, has a very checkered way of accepting what has happened. There are portions of society that wish to forget what has happened to them and move forward. But unfortunately, and I think there's very little research that looks at how trauma is passed on from generation to generation, in the way societies behave, in the way parents raise their children and their children's children, and how some things are rooted from traumas they cannot even articulate and do not know how to face. So I think the future of storytelling is an opportunity to heal these traumas and acknowledge what has happened, because most people experience certain things and feel certain feelings without necessarily understanding where the roots come from. But it comes from a space of denial or a space of wanting to move forward without having some emotional attachment to the past. But unfortunately, that is trauma. And I think in Namibia specifically, I think a lot of communities and societies are suffering from PTSD from colonialism and apartheid. And that can be seen in healthcare, can be seen in education, in the way people run their businesses. It impacts every social part of their lives. But because of a lack of contextualizing what has happened, from stories from those that have experienced it and their parents have experienced it and their grandparents have experienced it, not many people can actually pinpoint and identify them. And I think that's the power of storytelling, because it validates these traumas that even some of us, many, many years post-colonialism and apartheid, have of, that we don't know where they stem from. Our parents didn't know, so they didn't explain to us. In fact, they don't even know what it is. But through storytelling, I think you start identifying some behavior patterns, some root causes of the realities we are facing today. And I think that's the beginning of healing, because you see that it's not unnatural. It is a result of something, and I think that's the first step of embracing the past and using it as a tool towards healing and a future that has made peace with the past. In Namibia, we say a lot, we forgive, but we do not forget. But I think the first step would be to move towards that, to sort of unburden ourselves and generations to come from the hurt.
I just have to make a comment that I think that's interesting, because oftentimes when people have conversations about healing, there's some thinking that, well, healing is how we're going to make friends with the other side. And what you're talking about is people turning inward and coming to grips with this past, which was traumatic. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Lars.
Well, I mean, certainly, I think everything you said is just right, and maybe there's a lot. It's a huge question, and there's a lot to talk about. First, maybe I should add something very practical, because I shot in Namibia the whole film. We financed it in Germany, and we shot it in Namibia with a mixed team of Germans, Namibians, and South Africans. And so one future would be that we would find an infrastructure in a country like Namibia where a lot of films are shot. But usually it's American films, they come with their Mad Max huge trucks. They use the beautiful landscape, and they bring in a team from South Africa and America. They even bring in the cameras, everything, and then they just leave their waste. So you hardly find professionals in every field, because people cannot afford to work on you cannot afford to be a cameraman a whole year. You have to do, every filmmaker I met was like a writer, producer, actor, camera, DP, they do everything.
With a full-time job.
to make a living in this industry. But it's not that there's not a lot of advertising is done there and everything. So a very practical thing would be, to collaborate, to really collaborate, and on a bigger scale. Then, for example, if you apply for subsidies in Germany, you want to make a film in Namibia, they tell you, well, you have to, you have to spend the money where you get it. I get subsidy in Berlin. I have to spend the money in Berlin. I can't even shoot in Namibia. So making this possible is something very important.
Right.
And then, of course, it comes to the creative part. When we created our film, my film has a flaw. Okay, it has no Namibian writer on the screenplay. It's written by me. But I couldn't find in the time I was given, in the time, I mean, I have Gurli Jazama, the main actress, who consulted me a lot on the project. And I have the, Sophia Hakali, who's the line producer there, she consulted me. And so we did have people, but not really writers who really wrote the story. But then you go, again, you have to make it happen, and you want to tell that story, so you have to create a story that would pass the commissions that you have to go through in Germany. And I can tell you, if at the present stage, if you come with any project dealing with colonialism to a European Commission to find subsidies, they go like, it's the same commissions that give subsidies to all the romantic comedies and all the entertainment films, and it's not like everybody has an open ear to make a film about a relatively unknown genocide, like the genocide we did a film on. So the open, to have financing for collaboration, and not even on that topic, of course, we had a 13-year-old actress. She said, "God, I'm tired to play the victim." She was a Herero Namibian. She said, "I want to play other." She's 13. She want to play other parts, and of course, the future would be to go there and shoot beautiful films, not only dealing with the dark history, but also with the possibly bright future. But just to collaborate would be great.
Wow. Well, that brings to mind, I want to sort of prod that with you in terms of the area in which you're working. You're talking about some of the challenges that you have as a part of the future. Is there something in, having gone through that process, is there something that you think, or any solutions that you think could happen in order to help change that? Is it about changing the minds of the commission? Is it about,
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
There's a huge change happening already. There's right now, and it has been for the last, I don't know, maybe 5 years or so, that especially, we heard it before in the keynote, especially women in the industry have a different stand. I mean, now I'm the typical opponent. I'm the middle-aged white guy who has done films for 25 years. But now it is changing. There are other people telling other stories, and that is a great. So, but we have to be realistic. The cinema is dying, and the platforms are expanding, and the platforms don't sell films; they sell abonnements. They sell themselves. That's their product. So if you want to get them to tell other stories, you need to rise in awareness for other stories. You need a market for other stories, and it is happening. People have a different view on different parts of the global world now. And I think if you look at Africa, there are 1.2 billion people living on that continent. It's a huge market for the streamers. They all want to go there. And of course, they should not only then, they should wake up and not only tell these old stories from Hollywood, again, or with the Eurocentric perspective on things. They should find those filmmakers there to make those stories happen. But in those minds of the people who own these streaming platforms, it will still take some time until they really change. And of course, we are trapped in the huge amount of content that the algorithms, gives to the people is created already by these old forms, narratives, and now it will take some time until things change. So, I don't know what the solution of that will be, but it is a big process.
Well, that's interesting. So, do you have a response to?
Yeah, no, I just want to say, having gone through the whole film process, probably if you had asked me that question before, I would be like, the onus and responsibility lies with the storyteller. But having gone through the filmmaking process and 7-8 years of making a documentary, the storyteller is the production company, the distribution company, it's the editor, it's a whole field of people. It's the funders or the lack of funding. The whole system needs to be decolonized because I think also after the George Floyd incident and the Black Lives Matter campaign, then everyone started looking inwards and being like, we need to really have a look at this film industry that's 90% white. How do we change that, especially when we're telling black stories, you know, the editing, the sound, that whole team of storytelling needs to be looked at and how those perspectives are relayed, because at every point is where you make that decision on how we tell the story and how we choose to remember.
That's important. And you're in that, you said that you deal with filmmakers. And so when you hear a filmmaker talk about, you know, there has to be a market. And what comes to mind is you know, some of you may know that the story of Bill Cosby, and when the Cosby Kids or his programs came on, you know, the television industry was saying, there's no market. It's not believable. You don't have 2 black professionals in the household. So what do you say to that? I mean, how do you deal with it? Because we now know that clearly that's not true, and it's really a limited opinion. It's an opinion, it's not a reality.
Yeah, it's segregated because, well, I can only speak from a Namibian perspective, which does have a very small film industry. But I think the biggest appeal will be for, in our context, the younger generation that is more conscious to some of the societal or opinions about black stories not selling well enough, or black stories not being able to bring in the big bucks, black stories not having the same mileage as any other stories. I think they're actually societal groups that are pushing back towards that narrative, and especially young people who are intentionally holding watch parties or intentionally holding events with a black theme for black stories to show black communities as beyond what the very few 90% wanted to portray as one single black story narrative. And it's been beautiful to watch, but it's still gaining momentum, but definitely I think we will get to that point. I think the biggest challenge is getting the investment into actually getting those stories to see the light of day. And that is still quite difficult to get, as Lars has outright articulated.
Sorry. Do you mind?
No, go ahead.
No, I always wonder about, because I know there are thousands of burial grounds, African burial grounds around the world. And I know that there's an Annina somewhere fighting for their burial ground. And my story is a little bit different, only because I had the rare opportunity of 2 filmmakers asking me the question and choosing to tell the story through my experience. That probably won't happen again throughout the globe. So there are so many other stories that aren't being heard, and that really saddens me. And that's why I'm sat here today, because I'm still campaigning for those other sites, raising the voices of those Anninas around the world that don't have a filmmaker following them around, or the platform to have talks and panel discussions. And there are many more sites that are plagued by ignorance and are being exploited by a colonized system.
Well, that's a nice segue into who gets to tell the story, who gets to, you know, whose voice takes priority when we talk about memory and remembrance. Who would like to start? Would you like to?
Well, I've
And
obviously.
let me just add this: are there some conditions? Is there a certain context in which that takes place? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Well, when I started, I wanted to make a film about the ignored part of German history, the colonial times. Germans, if you go out now and you talk to people, most people don't have any idea that we have ever been a colonial power. So I wanted to make a feature film with the strength, with the emotion of cinema, and to create a film that would, you know, bring an audience to the awareness, oh wow, we have some responsibility for this Namibia, and it's part of our history too. And we did a very terrible thing that most people don't even know about, a genocide against Herero Nama, Damara and San. So then I started to look at the literature, and I found one piece of fiction by Uwe Timm that was written in the late 60s. He comes from a classical left kind of political approach. He wrote this book, but it's a soldier's novel. I couldn't take it. I didn't want to make a soldier's film. I went through the process of writing 8 stories, 8 different screenplays in a way, 8 drafts of let's say 4 different perspectives on that story. Always, of course, keeping in mind that I have to tell it from the German perspective, from the perspective of the perpetrators, and because it wouldn't be appropriate for me to go there and take one of the great freedom fighters that the Namibian cultures have, like Henrik Witbooi or Jacob Morenga. They have these great characters that would make a perfect action hero story, but it's not my story. I can't, we shouldn't go there and just take, oh great, can I make a film about your heroes? That's what we heard before. We don't want to do that. So you have to make it from the perspective of a German character. Then when you look at German characters, then there comes the next trap. Of course, you don't want to tell a story about a white savior. That's the usual approach then, because cinema needs the identification, the audience usually in my field, when we raise millions for a film, and people say, well, they want their money back, so they want a character that people can relate to. So who relates to it's not even an anti-hero, my character, it's a dark, immoral character. That is a challenge. Because people say, well, he's an asshole. And I say, yeah, of course, he's a colonist. And the people who gave me the money, it was hard to convince them that it's interesting and it's important to tell that story from that perspective, and you shouldn't go there and create a false hero that never existed, and a white savior who goes there and saves, who's not only then a hero and a false savior, he's also a false victim of colonialism himself. That's the biggest trap, that because you need the identification with the audience. So what I did is I wrote another way drama dealt with that since Shakespearean times. It was like, it's the degeneration of a character. He starts out as a young, naive character full of hopes and morals, and then he goes comes to Namibia, he witnesses the genocide, and he gets asked to cross over certain lines. He starts to steal for the Ethnological Museum, he starts to lie, eventually he starts to kill and to shed graves, and he does terrible things, and what leaves him in the end is a degenerate, which all colonialists have been. They've all been degenerate and mad. I mean, it's a story of madness, colonialism. So, but this is only what we can do at the moment to create these kind of stories. And I think there should be many other ways. As I said, we should find ways of stronger collaboration. You could divide a screenplay into 2 perspectives and to have one from Namibia and one from Germany. And so, but of course, you need a structure to do that. You need financing for that. You need the partners to do that. But it's
Well, just to expand on that for a second, I did see the film, and my question to you is, who did you envision your audience to be? Because when you describe this character as someone, I didn't grow up in Namibia, but I am a person of color. I grew up in the American apartheid, and I'd say if I watched a film of an evil white guy, that is something, no news to me. Where's the other story? So, my question to you would be, who did you want your audience? Who is your audience? Who did you want to change and impact?
Well, first of all, I think the film is a mirror to a European audience, and I guess to an American audience as well. It tells the archaic story of a degeneration of morals and corruption. Cinema doesn't do that so often. It does it sometimes, we know it, and there are some examples of degeneration plots. But in this case, in the context of colonialism, I think following the whole Black Lives Matter movement and raising questions about European colonial times, and I think it is time to tell these stories again. Shouldn't forget that not long ago the British made a film. It's called The Four Feathers. It's a classic adventure movie, and it's only a few years ago, and they were criticized for being anti-imperialistic in that movie. You know, so they say, you know, don't talk bad about our empire. So yes, you're right, it is no big news. Colonialism was terrible, but obviously the majority of people still thinks colonialism was also there to civilize the world. This is the classic thing that people tell you when you go to a dinner party, and I tell my story of my film. I have all these, you know, white Europeans sitting there and telling me, yeah, you know, but we brought civilization, didn't we? And you think, God, I'm sitting here with a bunch of assholes. And so that's the truth. And so this film foremost is for a European audience, for a German audience. It brings the bad news that they should remember. Then we showed it in Namibia. First of all, we brought it to Namibia and showed it to representatives of the Herero and Nama groups. And I think what helps them is, what we did is a lot of work was put into this reenactment of life at that time, not everyday life, but the circumstances of the genocide. You can see a Herero village in the traditional clothes, in the traditional dress, and how the Germans attack it and destroy it and they steal it. And when we showed it there, people said, this is what the ethnologists did with the heads of our ancestors. Some people don't even know that it was for pseudoscientific reasons that we brought thousands of skulls to Germany and still have them here in the collections. So these things are maybe not new for you, and I know that you can read them in many books, but most people you tell these stories, they watch, or the people you watch my film now, they'd sit there and they say, I don't know what's going on. I didn't know about the genocide. I didn't know about the stealing of the skulls. I didn't know about the fact that we still have them in our ethnological museums right here in Humboldt Forum. People don't know these things, and so it's for them. And I hope that the Americans find, you know, yeah.
No,
I hope actually everybody watches.
Thank you. No, that's because, yeah, thank you. And I would just, I want to hear from you, Nina.
Yeah.
And what I was struck by was the young actor or actors that said to you that, you know, I'm tired of being a victim. Yeah. And so I look to you, and what do you, what
yeah, I can echo Lars's sentiments, and I'm glad you said what you said. I haven't seen your film yet. There's only so much trauma I can handle at once. I'm still dealing with Saint Helena, and eventually I'll make the space to watch the film because my mom's in the audience here too, and I want to watch it with her, being from Namibian heritage. Earlier this year, I went to Swakopmund and I visited the German museum. It's not a German museum, it's a Swakopmund museum, but it's run by a German guy and German authorities. And I went through the whole museum, and it marks the whole history of Swakopmund, except the 4 years of genocide. It tells the history of all the animals in Namibia, of all the landscapes. There is not one single, it's got 2 floors and various rooms of exhibition. There is not a single mention of the genocide of 70,000 Nama and Hereros by the Germans. Absolutely nothing. That was shocking for me. But then I remember, I actually knew, I wasn't surprised. I knew it was going to be like that because learning history in high school, and I went to a German high school, and I can't imagine how hard it must have been for that German history teacher to have had to skip that chapter on the genocide, just brush over it. No one wants to reflect on that traumatic history, especially if you are the descendant of the perpetrator. So going to that museum, I wrote in the book and I said, lovely exhibition, very detailed, but you missed a crucial part of the German Namibian history. And I decided, I'm not just going to write in this book, I'm actually going to go talk to this guy. And I asked him, and he got so defensive, and that's where people are coming from. They have no idea how to deal with it. No one is showing them how, no one is leading the discussion, no one is saying, this is how we're going to do it, we're going to hold your hand through it. And I think he said exactly what he's probably said for 10 years. The exhibition is coming, we're working on it. We just need to figure out how we're going to tell the story. So in that case, if you had asked me that question, who tells the story? Through this journey of 10 years, I thought it needs to be grassroots, it needs to be us, people of color. And then I realized, but that's going to take us 300 years to do, because we first need to empower our people of color, we need to rise them up, we need to take them out of poverty and lack of finances and resources, and how long is that going to take? It needs to come from bottom up and top down, because the top down is the people that own the museums, the institutions, the archaeologists, the historians. They have all the finances, the resources. So it needs to come bottom up and top down. So like you said, Lars, the industry, the funders, your sponsors also need to have the ethical concerns of these stories and these narratives at heart.
If I can just also add there, just to also echo that the storytelling should come from different perspectives. The 1904-1908 genocide, as horrific as it was, and the extermination order against the Ovahero and Nama people, to this day, which many of those communities have not been able to recover, when 60% of your whole tribe is wiped away, it's difficult to recover even after so many, over 100 years. The story cannot just be told from a place of pain, in the perspective of one is a victim, one is a perpetrator. It's much more than that. These are people who had lives, family units, people that had a culture, that had a language, that had traditions on how they welcomed a child when it's born, how when a couple gets married, the type of traditions they did. All this, it's stories beyond the pain and beyond this disturbance in their lives and disturbance in their history. And I think the storytelling obviously should come from different perspectives, and I agree, bottom up, top down, but also the in-between I think is quite important, because how else are we going to honor the core and the soul of the people? Although this thing happened to them, it should not take away from the history that they would have otherwise needed to preserve all this hundreds of years to go, to come now. But just a bit of background and a bit of context. The 1904-1908 genocide is still quite a sore thorn in the flesh of many Namibians and Namibian discourse. And we still have really warped conversations in the country, because there's still German descendants who live in Namibia, who occupy the land, who identify as Namibian, who have only known Namibia since their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents settled in Namibia post before the genocide and after the genocide. So you still have really warped conversations on what then should the German descendants who are Namibian should relate to this very difficult history that we share between our two countries. But also, sometimes there's very difficult conversations to have. And I can give a few examples. For example, many German Namibians, just a few years ago, we had a street called the Bismarck Street in Windhoek. And we had a statue, the Bismarck statue in Windhoek. And that was taken down, and that created some uproar from the German descendants in Namibia. But it's because the conversation can be quite warped between them feeling like their German heritage is being scraped off in the country they now call home. But for most Namibians, that history comes with a lot of pain and a lot of trauma. So how do you balance some of these conversations and have a constructive conversation amongst all of us now being Namibians who both German descendants and native Namibians or people of Namibian heritage around this conversation of our very painful shared history, and coming to terms with some realities without feeling that it's taking the one from the other. So I think at this point in time, we're trying to have a conversation that is not around guilt or blame, but one that's constructive to feed out the facts, the realities of what that pain means up to today, and how that has had long-lasting effects, and how we need to have a better way of finally truly reconciling without just pushing certain things under the carpet and pretending like they're not there. I think that's more harmful. But we still have warped conversations, and I think we will get to a point where we can have constructive conversations about accepting the past and actually building towards restitution, and rectifying the wrong that was done, so that at the end of the day, everybody can collectively feel like we have dealt or are dealing with what we call as a shared history between our two countries.
Thank you for that. A quick question is, can you cite methods by which the country is sort of trying to get to that point, trying to, how are you engaging in those conversations?
Well, it's not, to be quite honest, it's not at the level where, the conversations between the descendants of the affected communities and the German descendants, for example, having this type of discussions yet. The biggest catalyst right now is the German government and the Namibian government coming to an agreement on how, one, we can acknowledge that genocide did happen in Namibia, perpetrated by Germans in 1904 to 1908. Secondly, that an apology towards the descendants of the Herero and Nama communities be given to those communities and to apologize for that genocide. And lastly, reparations, restitution of the damage caused, because unfortunately, till today, the effects of that genocide are still very clear in the eyes and livelihoods of Namibians still today, in terms of the occupation of the land, in terms of the economies of scale of those that have and have not. Right. So those are still very evident today, and that's why it's very difficult to sort of just put it under the carpet, because it's still very quite in your face, if you will, the effects of that genocide. But I do believe that we can get to a point where we can have constructive conversations at the societal level, among the things I've said before, that internal healing among the descendants of genocide, and the German descendants of Namibian citizenry now today, to feel like the Namibia they know is also truly their home, because we have all come to terms with our past, and we have rectified what has happened in the past, and now we can move forward together.
Thank you. And this is for all of you, but it stems from what Emma says. There's something that stuck out and Emma, you sent me a note about having this conversation without guilt. But at the same time, having conversations that say, we want an apology, do you understand what I mean? And
yeah.
just by the sheer fact that you're asking for an apology by default means you are guilty. And I think that sometimes that conversation about, we want to have that conversation without guilt is a way of trying to calm the other side down, if you will, so that nobody feels threatened. I know that I don't know how you have that conversation without feeling threatened, but I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Lars, Nina?
No, you go.
Yeah, no, just to say that, well, I think so far we have a special envoy to negotiate this agreement, and it's been 6-7 years of negotiation and talks and conversation. And this genocide happened over 100 years ago, and I do not see any scenario, if the conversation is from a place of guilt and blame, would actually yield the results we want to see, just from my way of looking at it. But one that is constructive, I think you can still articulate hardcore facts, realities, without putting the other person in automatic defensive mode, which I think will take longer to get to the results where we want to be. So that's from the perspective I said that constructive conversations that are talking about the realities of the ground, the facts of what happened, and then seeing each other as human beings, and what not everybody sees it as the logical way of doing things would be, but I think acknowledgement, apology, and sort of trying to bring restitution, I think would be a logical order of the day. But if there is guilt and blame, and the other party gets defensive, I don't think that would yield any of those results if it goes that way.
I think, you know, how the other party receives that acknowledgement defines how, you know, the process will go further. If guilt and blame and shame is accepted as the feelings of the day, it normally ends in business as usual. We will just push forward like we've been doing. But if it's acknowledgement, acceptance, and accountability and responsibility, that is something that you can internalize, I wouldn't say positively, but constructively. It's how you choose to step forward, you know, and you acknowledge your wrongdoings, but you also acknowledge that I'm not defined by my wrongdoings. I can choose to move forward in a constructive manner, and I can choose to engage in discussions and conversations in an open and a transparent and not in a defensive way. So that is also a choice. You can choose to be guilty, you can be ashamed, and these are also natural responses. Who wouldn't? It's not a small deal. It's not a small thing. You killed women, men, and children, you know, and to say it's also heavy. It's such a heavy thing to accept the burdens of your ancestors. And sometimes it doesn't feel unfair. A very human approach is necessary from both parties.
I just wanted to say, because you were asking about how long does it take, you know, what we can learn a lot from is from the relationship that German society and Israel had. If you fly to Tel Aviv these days, you know, there a few years ago when I made a film there, and then, you know, there were people flying with EasyJet back and forth between Tel Aviv and Berlin to party. It's 70 years after the Holocaust. It's crazy. I mean, and you can talk to everybody you do in restaurants, and everybody you meet, and especially in a film team, you talk about these things that were in your families, and you can learn a lot from that process. And of course, you can learn a lot from you know, how powerful that was done to make German society look at the terrible things they did during the Third Reich, and then face it all. And you still, I can tell you, if you're a German who works there on a film dealing with that topic, and you go there, you don't go to Yad Vashem without the feeling of guilt and shame. It's, you know, it's terrible. Nevertheless, then you go out into a restaurant and you have dinner with your Israeli friends, and it is possible. So and it's only 70 years. It's not 300 years. And I think, but what it needs really is, and what Germany did very well, and the culture did, is to create all these stories. And we have had many stories up to a point where people would say, you know, where we had this discussion: is this an industry already? That's another topic. It's what we really did is the culture. What filmmakers, storytellers did, is tell all these stories. And I think it's hard to find anybody out there on the street who hasn't heard about the Holocaust. It's very easy to go out there and find not anybody who has heard about the genocide against the Herero and Nama. And all the colonial, you know, if you talk to people and you ask them, you know what the Belgians did in Congo, they don't know. And they don't know. And so we have to tell these stories. That's a fact. But it doesn't take 300 years, I guess.
Hopefully.
Well, no, not if you approach it the way they did with the Holocaust. And that's not happening with the Namibian genocide.
No, right. And that's a question for politics. You know, if you, again, you know, it should be, if you come with a story of, you know, that deals with colonialism these days, people should say, yes, great, let's do it, let's finance it, let's tell a story from what perspective soever. And especially, you know, they should be very open, but find technical ways to raise money to subsidize projects in Namibia, for example, because Germany has a big, you know, or wherever in Africa, basically, but now these former colonies, of course, are a different thing. I think German politics have a different, culture politics have a different responsibility for that. It should be very easy to find money to make a film in Namibia by a Namibian director.
I also think, it's necessary to get uncomfortable. We're so used to sweeping these stories under the rug because no one wants to be uncomfortable. I don't want to say something to upset anyone. We need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable with these narratives because they will bring discomfort. And I think shame, guilt is necessary feelings that need to be dealt with. I think it was the shame of the Holocaust that forced people to change their way.
Yeah.
If you push away the shame, it's business as usual. Oh, there's nothing wrong if there's no shame, if there's no guilt. Let's embrace the feelings, the opposite feelings, so we can work towards a future that is.
And we shouldn't
more
forget,
humane.
even today, one of the greatest films about the Holocaust is Son of Saul, who won an Oscar. It was not financed, and the director tried to raise money in Germany, didn't get financed. He showed it to the Berlinale, they didn't screen the film. He brought it to Cannes and then won an Oscar for it. So it's still like today that, that even if you have a story like that's an exceptional story, people go like, can we get around it? Can we not show it? I mean, this is still happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because even by comparison, when you talk about the Holocaust and how it was handled, you had great global powers that stepped in, took away the toys of the Germans and said, you will sit and you will do this differently. And that's not what's happening in this case. And so I just throw that out there to continue. It's really part of the reality, our reality. Race is a reality, and that's why, when you say it'll take another 300 years, hey, it might. But I think that taking a look at the Holocaust and how that was handled, when you talk about people in Israel, you're talking about political powers that help draw a line and say, this is yours. And so the people are in a position where they feel that they can afford to move through this world. So, but it would be interesting to compare notes, take a look at really what happened there, and what perhaps could be helpful in this conversation. So I'd like to, I don't know how much more time we have or whether we run out of time, but I wanted to open it up to the floor if there were a couple of questions before I'm going to ask for your final thoughts. Oh, you do? Okay.
You do have your mic.
Hello. Yes, it works. Amazing panel, by the way. Fantastic. In the encouragement of us being uncomfortable and sharing our discomfort, I also want to share mine. Because when I hear a comparison of Holocaust with the genocide in Namibia, it makes me extremely uncomfortable. Yeah. I don't think these two are comparable. Well, one side of the story is I come from Tunisia and I lived with the Palestinian cause. So talking of another occupier who have a whole colonization history is another whole story. Of occupying the largest open prison in the world. But also, perhaps why all of that happened in Germany in terms of recognizing the Holocaust and, the spaces when you go around Berlin and you see the history and the recognition of it, it's because it happened on the soil of Germany. And so if maybe it's about the healing of Germans from that history as well. But it's when the healing of other populations, because the genocide happened in Namibia, a country goes to another country and occupy that space, and it doesn't live, even though you're saying the German descendant, who are living in that discomfort as well and trying to heal from it, as Namibians try to heal from it as the younger generation. A whole different story. And then, I was having a conversation with Rosebell, the race comes in when it's about occupying Black people and Black bodies and Black lives. It's different than the Israeli story. So I don't feel comfortable hearing that comparison, because that's the uncomparable. But also, when we do that, we need to recognize what is Israel also doing today, and the occupation of Palestinians' lands and bodies as it's happening as we are speaking. It's just ongoing. And that is another, we're talking of decolonization, that is another colonial system that we don't talk about much as colonialism. We talk about it more in a very politics way and UN-ish way, but we don't recognize its colonization. So it's not a question, it's just sharing our discomfort and encouraging everyone to share their discomfort, because that's how these conversations can be unpacked. And that's how, as Emma said, we can move forward when we do that.
Thank you.
Let me just answer quickly, because I brought it up. It did not compare the Holocaust to the genocide that happened in Namibia. I just said that if you look at the healing process and at the process and the huge strength that was undertaken there and if you look at the relationships that Germany and Israel have today, and I'm not saying that everything is perfect there. We saw it just now with the huge discussion about Documenta, and I know it's a huge different topic. It's just giving us hope that that possibly a conversation about terrible things that happened in the past is possible without and that we can not deny the fact that we did terrible things at all of Europe in Africa, and still find a process. And one thing that should be comparable, I think, is that the German and Namibian government have been negotiating about reparations only on a government level, only the governments. And the German government keeps saying, we do not talk to groups to the victim groups, okay? They don't do that. But they did that in other cases. And I don't understand why they don't do it. Because if you don't start the conversation with all the people who were involved and the representatives of that, and you only talk on the government level, then you have a problem in a multi-ethnical country like Namibia today, which is not, this is so complicated, but Namibia is a country that has been forced to live as one group by the German occupants, and so by colonists. And now they have their government. No one doubts that but you should talk to Herero and Nama people when you talk about the genocide that was committed there. So I'm just saying, I didn't want to compare anything. It was just giving us hope that.
Two more questions. I'm sorry. Thank you, Lars.